righty. So I invite you to find your feet. Find your feet. And just really, as always, like, as you close your eyes and you come into this awareness of your body, and as you really, can you really feel the bottom of your feet? And can you feel that connection to what they are resting on right now? How well do you know the resource that you are resting upon? And can you just take a moment as you breathe and breathing in all the way down to the bottom of your belly, taking a moment to breathe in this connection to this resource that you're resting upon. I'm resting upon the body of a tree. I have no idea where that tree came from. But I'm resting upon a life that was once rooted and was then unrooted and creates another way for connection. So really allowing yourself to come into connection and relation with all the things around you. And because we're in this sewing, we're sewing our classes together, we're sewing our experiences together, I invite you to re-presence that piece that you committed yourself to in our last class. That piece that you know that you're going to be speaking for this week, or that you're listening for this week. And perhaps you want to allow that just to have a presence in your heart and to be really present with you during this class that we're about to step into. And then you might want to just, after your next inhale, really exhaling out anything that's in the way. You might have some stresses, some little things moving around. So just allowing yourself to release, put down anything that could be in the way of the good work we're coming together to do today. And as you are ready, coming forth to join together and celebrate. What a treat to get to have Justin 2 weeks in a row. This is the first time we've ever done anything like this. And I really do think it's a real treat to have this kind of continuity and to have this kind of opportunity for depth in terms of what you have to offer and what you have to bring to our space. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Leah. I'm so grateful to be with you all. I was just sitting here, and I'll just share this with you. As I was sitting here with my hands over my heart, as I do kind of in all the groups, and normally I kind of do this behind the scenes while they're introducing me or whatever, as I just really try to drop into the energy of the group. And I remember thinking this last time at the end of your group when we were going, and I remember feeling it right, and I just felt it right now again. I was like, oh, I love this group. Like, that's how I felt right away. I was just like, I love this group. And I don't even know you all that well, but I'm with a lot of different groups, and I just want you all to know that you're radiating or creating a really strong web that I can feel just dropping into. And it's a privilege for me to drop into. It feels really nice for me to drop into as well. So I'm very grateful for that. And I'm just flashing back on, I think the last one was, I was like coughing like crazy, right? You guys were like, so, I don't know what was up with that, but I did speak the thing that needed to be spoken, and everything unfolded. So right now I am in Bali. I'm actually not in Bali. That is a lie. I keep saying I'm in Bali because I'm in between. So I'm on my way to Bali, but in order to go to Bali, you have to quarantine for 5 days in Jakarta, whether you have a vaccine or not, which makes not much sense, but you do, but it is, so it is. And so I'm on the first full day. Like, I got here 24 hours ago, and I am really just having an interesting thing with my jet lag, because I got myself on schedule. And then now this is from 12 to 2 in the morning. And then so that I'm like, well, so much for that. But then tomorrow I have something else that starts at 4 a.m., and so there were just things that were scheduled ahead of time. But I'm grateful, what a joy that I get to be here and do this, and that I can. I've always, I think that's a good tip that one of my mentors gave me a long time ago, was just like, no, none of this. Oh, I have to do this. I have to do this. No, I get to. How cool that I can do this, And I just am really grateful to be in this space to share with you all. So we're in for a dynamic journey together. But before we begin, I need you all to remember my little rules of engagement here. So rule number one is, remember, this is not a TV show. We're here together live. So we will continue to feed each other and feel each other's energy, and you'll feed one another. One of the ways that we do that is if you hear me say anything that you want to remember, you can type those quotes in the chat box. Yes, you already got it, Dominique. And then we throw our ones up. We throw our ones up so everybody can do that. The ones in the air to put a bunch of ones in the chat box. And if you weren't here for that last time, those ones in the chat box are how you kind of say like, yes, I'm with you. I got you. There's something that I like. There's something that I needed. And you can even like one each other, and you can talk in the chat box. It doesn't distract me at all. You can put questions in the chat box. It doesn't distract me at all. And, obviously just don't go on some crazy left field, tangent, but your comments in the chat box add a lot. So we'll be in this experience together. And today we're doing a really important talk as it relates to the power of diversity and mindfulness. And I think we've built up together as a group enough trust in one another to have this conversation in a really powerful way. And I think I might be, why can I see my Zoom screen? That is the weirdest thing. Hold on one second. Something weird's happening. There we go. Okay. So we have built enough of a relationship with one another from this last talk to really dig in here. And we're going to dig in today and start with talking about the power to change. The power to change. And the reason why I start here with the power to change is because so many of us have experienced, because we're in the world of transformation and personal transformation and human potential and growth, how many of you have experienced a radical change in your own life or the lives of one of your clients or somebody that you work with? Can you put your ones up or your hands up or something in the chat box? A change that seemed impossible. A change that was like, this is probably never going to change. I don't know how this is ever going to change. This seems like a wall that cannot be overcome. And through the work, we've watched it change. Yet, isn't it? And so I see all of you, Ray and Janet and Miss Brittany in Iowa. Hello. Always good to see you and everything. And Dominique, Cariana, Roxanne, Lisa, Megan, I see all of you, and I'll keep calling you out, Loke. And however, when we talk about change when it comes to social justice, racism, our family members who have isms that we may not agree with or that we think are harmful, how many of us then suddenly go, oh, that's probably never going to change? Inside, even though we want to say like, I believe in peace and I believe in love and I believe in like, right, we got that. But somewhere inside, as it relates to some of these things, there's this subconscious belief running the show that, those people, they're probably not going to change. They're never going to change. This racism is never going to end. Generations and generations, we're going to go ancestors and ancestors and ancestors and ancestors, and everyone's going to keep working for their entire lifetime to end this thing. And so why is it that we have this belief, we as a community who have seen incredible change and transformation, have this subconscious belief sometimes inside that certain things can't change? And the reason why this is important for me to name is, and Marianne Williamson was amazing at this, for any of you who were following her campaign trail, whether you were going to vote for her or not, or this or that, or your politics don't matter to me at all. But one of the things that she was inserting that I thought was incredibly powerful, and I think that was the most useful of her campaign trail, was she said, hey, spiritual people, if anybody's going to help this thing transform, it's us. We know what transformation really looks like. We know what it takes. We've sat in the fire of the shadow. We've looked at our deep truth. We know how much it takes to sit with the discomfort. We know how to hold ourselves with compassion. We know what the reflection is, the mirrors, all the things that we have to do to actually create that change. So let's jump in. let's be a part of this so that we're not just sitting in the background and the world is suffering because we don't want to be political, right? And I have to say, I was like a part of this group. Like I was one of, I don't watch the news, I don't do this, I don't do that. I was there, right? I was totally there before 2016. And then I was started asking, like, I think so many people finally kind of raised an eyebrow and said, what can I do? What can I do authentically that will be real and authentic to me, that doesn't go against my values, that doesn't put me in a position to do something that really doesn't feel aligned with who I am? But is there a way that I can make a contribution? Have any of you gotten there over the last few years of just wondering how you can step forward a little bit, even a little bit more? Yeah. And so this is where we are. And people often ask me, Justin, how is it that you are probably one of the most optimistic queer Black men that I've ever met? Because I really, like, my work is really not even, I'll give you a very specific quote here that I like to use, is there are lots of conversations about change, but that's very different than conversations that actually change something. And I think conversations about things are really important. Thank you, Leah, for the prayer hands. Like, I think conversations about things are really important, but that's not what I'm here to do with you today. And that's not the work that I'm even interested in doing. We can talk about racism all day. We can talk about the environment all day. We can brain dump, we can be pontificating scientifically about things all day and the philosophy all day and night. But that's very different than a conversation that actually changes something. And the conversation that I'm interested in having with you today, and the conversations that I'm interested in having in this space, are conversations that change something. And so I wrote an article last, gosh, it's almost been a year. I think it came out in July or August of last year, called Ending Racism: How to Change the World in One Generation. And I was very curious because after the George Floyd protests, and I'm getting a link for you guys, which is why you hear me talking. Give me 1 second. All right. So I'll put this link in. Leah. Ooh, Jesus, what am I doing here? Okay. You can pass this around. So it's endingracismtogether.com. And it has a pledge and an article. And I'm not going to go into the full article here, but I think it's a good read for those of you who are interested. And thank you, Lisa, that you saw this. And the reason I thought it was so fascinating is I was at Esalen, and for those of you who know, a spiritual retreat center in Big Sur. I was at Esalen for 6 weeks last year when they were closed, doing some diversity work with them. And by the way, Esalen has been doing a freaking incredible job training themselves on diversity and inclusion and change. It's been like top notch. So for those of you who are wondering about that, it's really, they're doing like reconciliation with the indigenous tribes, fully in it, twice a month, like the whole thing. It's really fascinating. And I'm grateful to be a part of that with them. And I was there and I was reading all the articles and the things that had come out about, there was all the New York Times best-selling books. There's Caste, and there was How to Become an Anti-Racist, and there was Me and White Supremacy, and there was all of the things, right? And I'm reading all the books and I'm thinking, gosh, why is it that every single one of these books is coming from a perspective that is racism will never end? Why is everything coming from this perspective that this is lifelong work? That this is work that our ancestors have done and we will continue to do, and generations and generations and generations. And I sat there and I thought, God, I don't want to be doing this shit for the rest of my life. I'm just like, absolutely not, and I was just asking a question, and the question that I was asking in the baths at Esalen is I simply asked the question, why not? Why can't racism end? Why not? Racism is something that is a modern creation in the last 250 years. Racism being something where we distinguish and differentiate people based solely off of the color of their skin. It is a Western invention in the last few hundred years of all of human history. There's obviously been many ways that we have created in-groups and out-groups over history, religion being the most common way, and gender being another very common way. But we've created in-group, out-groups. This is a thing that unfortunately human species do. But I believe that this phenomenon of creating in-groups and out-groups based on the color of somebody's skin is something that can absolutely be changed. I don't understand why it wouldn't be able to be changed. And it was really fascinating. You know, there's a book called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson that I recommend highly to everybody. I'll put a link in here later for you all. And she told this amazing story where Isabel Wilkerson wrote The Warmth of Other Suns or something like that, another book that's really popular and a best-selling book. And she was interviewing this young African woman from Africa. And the African woman said, "We don't have Black people in Africa." And Isabel's looking at her, and Isabel's a Black woman. And Isabel's like, "What do you mean? Like, that must sound like the weirdest comment ever. Like, of course you have Black people in Africa. That's like where all the Black people are, right?" And she goes, "No, we have Nigerian people in Africa. We have Ghanaian people in Africa. We have Yoruba people in Africa. You only become Black or white when you go west." You literally, like, and think about people in Europe, right? They don't really generally classify themselves as "I'm white." It's like, oh, the Germans and the Poles, and they have, you know, their whole thing that they do there, right? The French and the this and the that. And so it's really a Western, and it is obviously, there is a lot of racism in Europe, obviously. But overall, this was a thing that started in the West, polarizing people into two colors that they are not, when really they're shades of ivory and beige and brown. And going on the opposite ends of the spectrum and saying, here's Black, here's white. Definitions that are constantly changing over and over and over. Italians once were not considered white all the way up until the 60s, right? And, you know, it's these definitions that are constantly shifting. And so in my article, I just constantly pose this question: why not? And what might it be? I think once you have a problem that is happening for long enough, the question has to shift from what's causing the problem to what's causing the problem to persist in the first place. Why is it persisting? If this is a problem that most people agree is not good, why does it persist? And so my article poses some ideas on why it might persist, meant to be a little bit, you know, kind of make you think a little bit, and meant to be a little bit, you know, it's not meant to be mischievous in any way or triggering in any way, but I think it turns some things upside down for people. And then if you, at the end of the article, it invites people to sign a pledge called the Ending Racism Pledge that we've had thousands and thousands and thousands of people sign, which I'll invite you all to as well. So again, that's at endingracismtogether.com. And so again, people will ask me, you know, Justin, why are you, how can you be so optimistic as a Black man, as a Black queer man? Like, what is, you know, what's the deal? And the reason why, and this is another part of my story that I think will surprise many of you, is I grew up in this family. So this is, how did I get to that side? Oh, that's me. Okay, so here's little Justin, which you've seen before. And here is my mom and dad. So my dad is African American. Originally, his family, like many generations back through ancestry, we've tracked to West Africa, but in the United States for many generations. And obviously through slavery, the whole thing, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. And my mom, this is a part I want you all to track very closely as I'm talking about. My mom is Persian and Middle Eastern, but adopted into an Italian Catholic family. And my mom was adopted when she was 2 days old into this family. This is the family that raised me. This is my family that I've grown up with my whole life. This is my mom. In the very front, you see my grandmother, Betty. This picture is very old, from I think probably the 80s at some point, or even earlier than that potentially. And my grandmother's in the very, very front, Betty, and there's all of her brothers and sisters who came over to the United States from Sicily on a boat. Okay, so when I'm talking to you Italian Catholic, I'm talking that kind of Italian Catholic. Okay, pasta dinners on Sundays. My great grandmother, who's there, who we call Big Nana, is the one. She's the oldest one, which you can probably see in kind of the very light colored thing with all the white hair. She, she used to breastfeed all the kids on the block. It was like that kind of a thing, which was like normal back then, and they all lived, very close to one another. And so this is the family that adopted my mom. And when my mom, and mind you, they had Black friends, they came from struggle themselves over to the United States, to the East. They came straight into Pittsburgh, California. Most people don't know there's a Pittsburgh in California, but in the East Bay, that's where I'm from originally. And when my mom decided she was going to marry this Black man, this family had a Sunday dinner, which they always had after church. Mind you, this is after church, of course. And they decide that if my mom chooses to go forward with marrying my dad, that they are going to disown her and never speak to her again. And mind you, this is a family that had Black friends, but their daughter, no. How could she marry this, N-word? That's not going to happen. So the whole family gathered the meeting. They called my mom in and they told her, and they thought they were going to be able to call it off. My mom, being my mom, said, peace out. I mean, obviously it was much harder for her than that. And my mom got married and nobody in her family was there. And this is my great grandfather, who we called my big daddy in my family, walking my mom down the aisle because not one person in her entire family came to her wedding. And when my dad, I just want you to imagine this, like when my family kicked my mom out, my mom went to go live with my dad's family before they even got married. And my dad wasn't even living there. So like my mom went to go live with my dad's mom. Imagine this, right? And they're like they're like 21 or 22 or something like this, and the compassion that had to be there from my grandparents on my dad's side to be like, here's this family who hates us and we're welcoming their daughter in who's marrying my son, and she's going to move in with us, when we're taking her in, and then we're going to throw a whole wedding for them, and now my dad's side paid for the whole wedding, the whole thing, like that level of compassion and love that had to be there. I really like to honor for them because it's a big deal. I try to imagine one of my sisters and that happening with them and then being like, my husband's moving in because they hate, or my fiance's moving in. We'd be like, oh my God, who are you marrying? And so, but what happened next is why I'm sharing this story with you, because what happened next was an actual miracle. So my mom and dad get married. And after that, this Italian Catholic family gets back in Sunday dinner. And my grandfather goes to the family and he said, look, this is ridiculous. My grandfather and my mom were very close. And he said, it didn't work. We thought we were going to stop her. It didn't work. I don't know how we're going to figure this out, but we have to welcome her back. This is not what we want. This is not what we're going to do. And look, I'm sending you so much love because I know this story very well. It's tough. And I'm giving so many props to you because I also apologize if this is triggering for you at all, but I imagine that it's actually empowering, right, to you. Yeah. So yes, I'm with you. I see you. So, I have lots of roots in not lineage, but like just lots of connections in Hawaii, and I spend a lot of time there. So I'm loving you big. And so my grandfather goes back and says that we're welcoming her back. And what happened here is what the miracle is. So half of the family, half of these 9 brothers and sisters said, if you welcome Barbara back, we will never speak to you again. And anybody who knows Italian Catholic families knows they know how to hold a damn grudge. If they know how to do anything, is they know how to hold a grudge. And the other half of the family said, we're coming. And so it split this family who came from Sicily on a boat, who were raising their kids together, to split them in half, all the way to the point where everyone in this picture, except for my grandmother, because she's the youngest, everyone in this picture has passed away. My grandmother's now 86. The 4 and 4 didn't go to each other's funerals. That's the level of grudge that was held. But the 4 that decided to come back, here's what happened next. my family had a beautiful reconnection, and this is how we ended up growing up. There was an incredible space of love and connection created. At the bottom, you're seeing my Uncle Peter, who was like the worst of the worst. He actually didn't come back right away. He was in the no group, and then he like slowly kind of came over. And he ended up being the one who put me through college. He became great friends with my grandmother. At the top left, you see my grandpa and grandma and me. That's me as a little baby with my mom. My favorite picture is on the right, is my dad and my grandmother dancing together at the reception that they held for their wedding later. And then in the top center, you see me and my cousins and my siblings, like all together with my grandfather, who is just one of the most secure attachment, incredible, loving, awesome fucking men in my entire history of my life. And so when people ask me, how is it that I'm so motivated about this concept of not just talking about racism, but ending it, it's because I have literally watched it disintegrate in my own family, in my own DNA. And when I say in my own DNA, I say from both sides, and not that there's racism on both sides, but the effect of racism on both sides. Watching it disintegrate. And it didn't disintegrate, and this is a really important concept for us as people in spiritual community. One of the virtues that I think we have falsely, one of the virtues that we hold up in the spiritual community often is this virtue of oneness. Oneness. We're all one. We're all made of the same stardust. We all are just human beings. We all want the same thing. Okay, yes, check. True, all true. And and we do not all experience life on this planet exactly the same. Right. And so like this oneness aspect is a real easy way to kind of like spiritually bypass the reality of what's really going on here, because there's both happening. We are all one and we're not. And if you even, I don't think that the greatest virtue, and I know that my family didn't end racism inside of our family by oneness. They ended it by intimacy, vulnerability and intimacy. And for me, the greatest virtue is not oneness. The greatest virtue is vulnerability and intimacy. And that's what we really need. And if we go into any of the spiritual texts, from the Bible to science to the Vedas to everything and beyond, and especially when we go into like the yoga traditions, what do we even say that the universe came into being for? To differentiate itself so it can experience itself. And so the differentiation is not a bad thing. We do not need to aim for this idea of putting all of our cultures and values and traditions into a Vitamix and becoming like a we are all one smoothie. It's like not what we need. What is needed is this ability for us to come together in a space of vulnerability and intimacy and connection, and to mess up and to be imperfect and to know that we're going to make mistakes sometimes, and to hold each other accountable with compassion and love, and to show up in the shadow and in those fierce moments together and be able to move through. Do you think my family didn't have some intense moments, some major moments to uncover and undo? Massively, right? And some big vulnerabilities to share? Massively, but they showed up and we created an entirely different reality from what was present at the beginning of this. And it didn't take that long. Like people are like, oh, yeah, we had things come up over the years that had to happen as I grew up, but overall it didn't take that long. Like my parents, this all happened when my mom was 21. They had me when I was 23, my second sister by the time they were 25. And, it very soon, as for me growing up, I didn't know any of this. It was all loving by the time I had any conscious memory, and then it was like, oh, little hiccups. Oops. My 80-year-old uncle just said something super racist. And then the family like holds him accountable. I'll tell you one story that I wasn't going to tell here, but we have a little spaciousness. So I'll tell you. And then I'm going to get into the main bulk of the teaching. So when I got into college, this is classic, and he's passed away. And I know he laughs at me every time I tell the story because he gets so embarrassed by it, but he also gave no shits. So he was 80, 86, 85 or something like this at the time, maybe 83, I don't know, somewhere in your 80s, an old Italian man. And I get into college, I get into UCLA. I'm the first person in my family to get into college, and I have a full ride scholarship. and academic scholarship. And we're announcing this to our family at, guess what, a Sunday pasta dinner, right? So we sit down, the whole family's there, and we announce it. And my uncle Peter, who's the one in the bottom of here, of this picture, the one who's here at the bottom next to me with my graduation cap on, his response, literally from the top of his Italian lungs, was, "Oh, thank God. Oh my God. See, and thank God. You know why you're so successful? Because they don't even know you're Black. They don't even know you're Black. You're not like those other Black people, those other colored people. You're not like them. It's because we raised you right." You know, this comes flying out of his, it's like first words after we make the announcement. And my whole family is just like, and, you know, because my family had built this sense of like, okay, like we know his heart, we know he's undoing many generations of shit. You know, my sisters and I, you could have dropped a pin in the room. And then my aunt, who's an old person, she goes, "Oh, Pete." Like, you know, she's like, "You are so ridiculous. You can't say that, racist," you know, whatever stuff. And he's like, "What do you mean?" And then the whole explanation happens and he gets it. And then he apologizes and he's like, "You know, that's not what I meant." And, you know, it's the system has impacted him too, right? And so we could have gone in and, "Oh, he's so racist," and write him off. I can't believe. No, this man literally, like, I got a full ride academic for my housing and my tuition, but he paid for everything else. He bought my car. He put me through everything. So there was no hate there. You know, it was a deep learning. And if we weren't able to show up in that vulnerability and intimacy together, he would have never learned. He would have never learned. The one thing he never got that was just terrible is he was, until the day he died, he could not, we kept changing him. He kept calling Asian people Oriental. And we were like, "No, you cannot." Like, we're like, "No, Oriental is a flavor, is a place," you know, is like a season, is not a people. You don't call a people that anymore. That's old. That's like calling people colored people. Like, we don't do that anymore. And he just like could not grasp that one. But anyway, you know, some things you get, some things you don't, but he moved a long way. And so I tell all of you this because the work that we're doing today and the work that we get to show up to do together is unique to us. Because in this kind of web of infinity, here we are at the center. And what we have the opportunity to do is to do the healing work that our ancestors were not able to do because of the context, because of the education, because of what's present now, because of what we have, because of the books, because of whatever reason. And I love this quote by Dr. Sarah King. Some of you are going to want to write this down because it's a really good one. She says, "We are beings that live at the nexus of the dreams of our ancestors and the memories of our descendants, right here at the center of infinity." I'll say it again. We are beings that live at the nexus of the dreams of our ancestors and the memories of our descendants. That's her quote. And then my add-on is, and we're right here at the center of infinity, and we just keep going, right? It keeps going. And so we're here to do this work now, but hopefully it's not the same work if we're doing work that actually changes things. And so that's what it calls us to do. And the reason why this has so much to do with, for example, something like mindfulness and why I incorporate meditation into this is because meditation and mindfulness really gives us, as we know, this space of compassion, right? The space of compassion. And how do we have compassion and openness and vulnerability, but not spiritually bypass at the same time? And one of the things that I will talk about a little later in this talk today is the difference between calling people forward instead of calling them out. And this is, calling forward is a term that I've started to use quite a lot lately, because calling out or calling in or wherever direction you want to call people, none of it works if you're not calling them forward. None of it works if you're using shame and blame. And there's tons of research on this, right? Tons of research. And again, this is why I think it's amazing that the spiritual, personal growth, transformational community can come into this space and do some deep work, because there are decades of research. While the research on social justice is quite new, there are decades of research on brain science, for example, and psychology that tells us that when you approach somebody with shame or blame, literally the centers of your brain that are responsible for learning and growth shut down. And so, yeah, we might want to be heard all the time. We might want to have to speak our truth. But what are you speaking it for? And who are you speaking it to? And what's your intention? Is your intention just to be heard? If so, great. But for me, I ask my question, my intention is to help change something and move us in the direction of ending racism. So what internal work do I need to do so that I can hold the container and the space for whatever is coming towards me so that I can show up and help move things in that direction, not just be heard. Be heard is, I think, like our kindergarten stage of like what we do in this movement. I think it's what the past maybe 5-7 years have been about. Like, we need to be heard. I'm not saying people don't need to be heard. I'm saying everybody don't need to hear you. Right? And also, everybody doesn't need to hear it in the same way. Just like you wouldn't talk to your husband in the same way that you would talk to your kindergartner, right? In some cases, depending on the topic, because of their level of evolution, and your goal of communication is to get something across. So what is our best way to get that across? And I center my intention around, if I have an opportunity to try to change this person's mind, if I have an opportunity to try to open this person's heart, what is the way that I do that? And how can I process whatever hurt and pain I'm feeling in a space that's actually safe for me to process that, instead of in this place that might just cause harm all around and around and around. And so we'll talk more about calling forward a little bit later. But what I want to talk about right now specifically is, and I have some research, but I might come back to it later. I want to kind of get into the meat of this right now, about taking action. And what it is that we can now do to learn to find our authentic voice in the movement for equality. Quick question, just by show of hands or ones, how many of you are interested in a quick moment of actual research around mindfulness and diversity and bias? Would anybody be interested in that? Okay, I was feeling it, like I was skipping it, and then I was like, So let me rewind. So before we get into the action steps, I am going to pull up a couple fun research studies for you specifically about mindfulness and diversity. So I remember I told you guys last time that I'm very woo. Leah heard me like right before we started. I was like, don't push go yet. I'm not wearing my crystal that I wear every time I talk. But at the same time, as I'd like run and grab my crystal, but at the same time, I'm a complete neuroscience geek. Like I geek out on the psychoeducation and everything, because it's so fascinating to me how it all lines up. And so this one is about mindfulness decreasing implicit bias. So they've done studies and that show obviously that we all make negative and positive assumptions about other people based on superficial differences in appearance and social identity. This for us is called implicit bias, and it's happening all the time. It's a thing that humans do. It's a part of the human condition. We do it, evolutionarily to keep us safe. But research has shown that just even a 10-minute mindfulness practice, they did a massive study, and it showed that it decreased implicit bias towards African-American people and elderly people around ageism. And obviously, I think it can translate into many other isms, but this was one of the biggest study. So it shows that we can undo this pattern through some practices like mindfulness. Here's another one that might be a little small for you to read, so I'll read it. It's about stereotype threat. And it says, research published in Consciousness and Cognition shows that a 5-minute mindfulness practice can reverse the impact of stereotype threat and increases our performance. So they had 71 female undergraduates who took a math test, and then randomly to put them in a 5-minute either mindfulness practice or a control group, meaning they didn't do a mindfulness practice. They were told that the second math test was to explore why males are better than females in math. That's what they were told, right? So they were given this stereotype right up front. There is plenty of research, and one of them here is I talked about the math test, and there were 71 female undergraduates who took a math test, and then a half of them had to do a 5-minute mindfulness practice, and then the other half of them didn't do the mindfulness practice. And then they were told that they were going to take a second math test, and they were told, all of them, that the second math test was to explore why males are better than females in math. So this was like the context they were given as they were going into the second math test. And the group that received the mindfulness training performed significantly better on the second test, even after being given that stereotype threat. So the threats that we have of like, well, women can't do this, or if you're Black, this, and if you're gay, this, and if you're this, that, the mindfulness practice helps us come back home to ourselves. And the control group, they didn't just stay the same on their second test, they performed worse on the second test. So it can affect some of the mindfulness can actually impact and divert some of the negative side effects of what discrimination is inside of our lives, even when it's not being told to us directly. And then finally, mindfulness helps increase emotion regulation. And a lot of us know this. So like research shows that mindfulness increases our ability to regulate difficult thoughts and emotions without becoming overwhelmed or shutting down. It increases I look at it like a window of tolerance, and we're comfortable experiencing anything in here. I kind of talked about this last time. And as we expand if we do more mindfulness practice, our window of tolerance expands. And the reason this is important is because in moments when we're triggered, in moments when social justice or politics or these things come up, and we feel that, how much practice and space do we have holding it so that we can step into the conversation in a way that allows us to respond instead of react, or respond in a way that's in alignment with our values and what it is that we actually believe in and want to move forward, or pause and choose to speak instead of being silent, right? Because we're actually tapped into our power and our center and the truth of who it is that we are. And so all of this, right? All of this is incredibly important, but primarily because it leads us to the most important step, which is where I was getting to a little bit earlier, which is really about action. And so what I want to talk about with you all now, because we can sit and meditate and again, pontificate about and pray about and send love and light about and do all the things about, but they're very different than having conversations about something, than conversations that change something. And so how do we step into learning to find our authentic voice in the movement for equality? What is it that is authentic and real for you? And the reason why I think there's so much trepidation, other than perfectionism and fear and all of that around speaking up and using your voice in the movement, is because so many of us think we have to do it a certain way that looks the same way as somebody else is doing the work. Or we compare what some activist or somebody is doing on social media or one of your friends is doing to what we should be doing. And we're all coming from a different vantage point. And if we each step in, as we talk about in all the ways as it relates to creativity and our purpose in this, same rules apply as our spiritual creative practices and social justice, is if we all show up in a way that's authentic for us, then we cover all the bases, right? Because each of us will express in a way that is real for us and in an area of the world that only we can reach, only our voice can actually reach because of who we are and what our experience is. So this is a really important topic around authenticity. And if we're not using our authentic voices, then whose voice are we using? That's a really interesting question to ask, right? If we're like, we have to find our authentic voice. Okay, well, where did it go? And whose voice are you using instead? If it's not your authentic one, is a really important question to just ask ourselves. And I want to have a conversation with you all as it relates to this topic about something that I've come to call the big P. I'm very curious if any of you can guess what the big P is. If you had to guess, what is the big P? Presence? Nope, but a good one. I want to see what your guesses are. Problem?
What's your purpose?
Purpose, close, but not it. None of these are wrong, but they're not the ones that we're going to talk about today. Let's see what else you got. Picture, prejudice, persistence, peace, perspective, point of view. These are all really good. Okay, so let me tell you.
Passion.
Passion. That's a good try as well. So let me tell you what the big P actually is. The big P is, oh, I lost my slides. Privilege. Privilege. And I know some of us, when we hear the word privilege, oh, Jody, you said it. Sorry, I didn't catch it. When some of us hear that word, we roll our eyes, and anybody who's in, social justice work, oftentimes right now will be like, oh God, that was so not 2019 talking about privilege. but I want to talk about it in a way that's a little bit different than you might expect. That kind of flips this concept on its head in some ways, and I think helps us understand it in a space of much greater compassion. So when we first hear the words privilege, because of the state of the world right now, we often think of white privilege, right? We instantly go into this concept of white privilege versus this privilege and that. But I want to help us remember that privilege is not just limited to race privilege, right? There's lots of different kinds of privileges that we can have. For example, like being neurotypical, right, is a privilege, or being able-bodied is a privilege. And so before we go any further, I'm going to put up this little scale, and it says not privileged at all on the left, barely privileged, privileged in the center, significantly privileged, and then very privileged on the right. I want you to type in the chat box where you imagine you land on this scale, just as honestly as you can. Very, not very, privileged, kind of privileged. Where do you imagine that you are on this particular scale? And then we're gonna do something really interesting together. So very, very, very significantly, great, keep them coming. Significantly, very significantly, between privilege and significantly. Cool. All right, so let's explore a little bit more here. Excuse me for 1 second. I'm sorry if my eyes seem a little distracted. I have something funny going on with my slides. So let me just fix them instead of trying to fix them and talk at the same time. And then we'll be able to dig in properly. Okay. So let's talk about privilege. And I want to switch around the way that we sometimes think about privilege. And I need you to remember this quote. If you take one quote from me today, I think this is the one, other than the conversations about change and change something, but this is one that changes something. Privilege isn't about what you've gone through. It's about what you haven't had to go through. Privilege isn't about what you've gone through. It's about what you haven't had to go through. And when we reframe privilege in this way, it changes everything, completely. Because what happens as soon as we start thinking about privilege of what I've gone through, what you've gone through, is then we get into this, what I call the oppression Olympics. Well, my family went through the Holocaust. Well, my family had slavery. Well, Jews have been persecuted for all of these years. Well, women have had to go through this. Well, I'm gay. Well, I'm this. Well, I'm that. We've all been through shit, right? And as soon as we get into this kind of battle of the oppressions, we're off track. Now we're fighting amongst ourselves instead of fighting against what we always forget that the common enemy is injustice, not one another. The enemy is injustice, not one another. But then we forget because we're worried about, who's more privileged and who's not, and whose lives matter, and if the blue lives matter, if the black lives matter, if these lives matter and these lives. And I'm not saying that I'm not dissing the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm actually just saying that the conversation that we forget as there becomes any kind of dissonance around this is that even the conversation of Black Lives Matter is not about somebody's life mattering more, right? It's about somebody's life mattering, period. And so this is where people get a little bit confused about all of this. And the important part of this is, and this is a quote from Darnell Moore, who is a colleague of mine who wrote a book in 2017, which this might feel a little eerie to you, well before George Floyd. And here's his quote. It says, "If we can only name the feet that are situated on our necks, but fail to name and recognize the ways our feet are situated on someone else's neck, we will never, ever be free. And Darnell Moore's a black man, queer black man who wrote this. And the reason this is important is because it's so easy for us as spiritual people, as good people, as people who are in growth and transformation to be like, we're the good ones. But those people over there, you know what I mean? Those people over there. But we have to really look at the ways that our feet, even as us as good people, are situated on someone else's neck. And the way that this shows up is often in what I call the secret spaces of your life. Who are you being in the secret spaces of your life? This is where the real damage happens, right? This is where the damage happened, for example, with my family, who had black friends, who are Italian, who is this. Who are you being in the secret spaces of your life? And I'll give you a quick story about this that will help you understand what I mean and might help you expand this a little bit in your understanding of how we can have our feet on somebody else's neck. So growing up, my uncle, not my uncle who I showed you, that was my great uncle, my actual uncle on my mom's side. He was the first person in our family to have a cleaning service, come and clean his house once a week. And when I was a kid, it was the joke about like my bougie uncle who can't clean his own house and he has a cleaning service, and our family would tease. And it was an actual service. It wasn't like he found some person and hired this one individual person. He called a company, the company came over, they interviewed him in a big van, came over, and he gave him the key or the code to his house, and they would come when he was at work. And he never met the actual people cleaning his house. But growing up, anytime somebody came and cleaned my uncle's house, my uncle would say, "Oh, Lupe came today. Lupe came to clean the house." Right? And so I saw some of your faces go, "Ooh," right? So I'm going there with you, right? So here's one in my own family. So growing up, we had this thing where my mom would be like, "Clean your room. Who do you think I am, Lupe?" Because like my uncle had Lupe, So here we are, a family of people of color, mixed, whatever, having this Lupe conversation. In private, never really in front of anybody else, inside joke, doesn't really mean any harm, not that big of a deal, right? In some ways you would say, in the grand scheme of things. But then fast forward to last year, 2020, I'm giving this talk that I'm giving to you right now, I'm giving all over the place on Zoom, companies, everywhere. And it was, I think, probably in July of last year, I walked into my friend Christy's house, and she was packing up for a trip. She was going to go visit her family for the first time after she'd been quarantined. And her place was a mess. And I walk in the door and I said, "Girl, your place is a mess. You need to call Lupe." And I almost fell out of my skin, because I saw myself in that moment and I went, I teach this shit. And here I am. And I paused, and Christy's looking at me. She still didn't catch what happened, right? She just was like, "Oh my God, I know it's a mess." And I paused, I closed my eyes, I put my hands over my heart, like right there in that space, because I felt the judgment coming up. I felt the wanting to ignore it coming up. Should I say something coming up? I did what I know as a practice. I paused, and she said, "What's up?" I said, "Just 1 second." And I just paused. And I said, "I cannot believe I just said that." And she was like, "What?" And I said, "I just said, did you hear me say about Lupe coming over? And isn't it so sad that you didn't even notice it?" And I said, and I explained the story to her and why it wasn't okay. And I made a commitment in that moment. I said, "I will never, ever, 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 ever say that again. I will never say that again. And if I do say it again, if it slips out in some crazy unconscious moment, my commitment is that I will stop. I don't care what circumstance I'm in. I don't care if it's in the grocery store. I will stop and I'll explain to whoever I'm talking to about why it was not okay that I said that." And that's my commitment. And I could have got mad at myself. I could have beat myself up. I did for a second. I didn't beat myself up, but I was kind of like, "Oh, for real, Justin?" And then I went, wow, look, here it is. Even in me, right? And this is the way that we show up for the change, is to go, I'm not going to get it right every time. I'm not going to be perfect. But when I do get it wrong and I catch it, when someone else calls me forward, when I notice it myself, how am I then showing up in that moment to help move the energy forward? And so that was my commitment. And in a class, I'll tell you another thing that just happened very recently. This was maybe a month and a half ago. You've maybe noticed that I like cuss sometimes when I'm talking. And I think I like dropped an F-bomb in a class when I was speaking, I don't know, a month ago, maybe at the most. And at the end of that, I said, and I say this all the time, it's like my go-to phrase. I said, excuse my French. And I just kept going. And I'm giving this talk, the same talk I'm giving to you right now. And I'm going. And some woman very lovingly in the chat box said, hey, I'm French. And I just want to let you know that it's really offensive to me and to us. And it makes me sad when I hear you say, excuse my French, because our language is so beautiful. And I don't know why Americans always say, if they're saying something offensive, that they're speaking French. And I was so glad. It was a talk with, I think, like 700 people in it. So the chat was going really fast. And I was so glad that I caught it. So I paused and I said, hey, everybody, we have to address something here. And so I looked at the woman's name and I read what her comment was. And I said, that's how you do it. And so right now, my commitment to all of you is that I will not say this again. And the same thing. And if I do, because it's like a back of my head. If I do, I don't care what kind of talk I'm giving. I don't care if I'm on Oprah. I will pause and explain why that's not okay. And in my vulnerability of doing that, I will be able to help other people see why it's not okay. Just like I'm sure many of you have never even thought of it, right? I never thought about that. And so this is what we have to do when we are showing up in a really strong and powerful way with vulnerability and connection. So we're going to do an exercise together right now. So you're going to need either a piece of paper or something to write with, or you can use your computer, even if you're not going to be writing a lot. But before we do this exercise, I have a video that I want to show you all. And I want you to watch this video with a big, wide open heart and a lot of compassion. And before we do it, just put your hands over your heart and check in with how you feel right now. And then we'll watch the video and check in afterwards. All right. Some of you may have seen something like this before, but now watch it in the context of what we talked about with privilege. Here it goes.
Some people are born into families where they have to walk miles just to get water. All I have to do is turn on a faucet. That's privilege.
If you have ever tried to change your speech, if you were embarrassed about your clothes or house, if you would never think twice about calling the police when trouble occurs.
I think privilege is when some people have some things and other people don't have things.
I feel privilege is something that you don't even really have control over.
I think it'd be silly for me to say I don't have a fair amount of privilege, considering like the country I live in and the job I get to do and the college I was allowed to go to.
I suppose being a white male will help me end up somewhere towards the front, but I'll take a few steps back from being gay.
I don't think I'll make it to the front. I think I'll maybe be in the middle. That's just the gut feeling I have.
If your parents work nights and weekends to support your family, take one step back. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, take one step forward. If you were embarrassed about your clothes or house while growing up, take one step back. If you have ever been diagnosed as having a physical or mental illness or disability, take one step back. If you have ever been bullied or made fun of based on something you can't change, take one step back. If you get time off for your religious holidays, take one step forward. If you came from a supportive family environment, if you can see a doctor whenever you feel the need, if you are able to move through the world without fear of sexual assault, if you took out loans for your education, if there were more than 50 books in your house growing up. So these are your final positions.
I think it felt kind of strange for everyone.
It's a hard thing to discuss or even reflect on.
It was very awkward. I think when you can represent it so visually like this and so immediately, it definitely takes on a new form.
I think we were like all joking around in the beginning. It was pretty lighthearted, and as soon as the questions started coming in, the mood shifted immediately, and we all it was just silent.
Just looking back and seeing like a bunch of people behind you is not a good feeling.
It's like weird how you want to like hold on to explaining a certain privilege, like, oh, but that's not actually me, because like I had to work really hard for that. So it's weird to like take a step forward when you feel like you're taking a step forward with someone else, but you wear a lot of the baggage of like how those things were hard.
It was like more emotional than I thought it would be.
It reminded me of when they talk about slavery in high school and you feel like angry for a few days, but then you just realize like, this is how it is.
For me, it was kind of frustrating almost to look back and see how much further some people were behind me, and realizing that, you know, a lot of that stuff, no amount of hard work or even legislation can make up that gap.
It's interesting being an Asian American because you're not really sure where you fall on the spectrum of privilege.
I know that for me, one of the reasons I ended up so far back was that there are questions around safety as an African American, as a woman, as a gay woman. There are just so many different ways that I don't feel safe.
I feel like I just learned to be grateful for what you have. You know, we're in such a huge society where it's always complaining about what you don't have. It just shows you that for some families, like each family, you're meant to do better. My grandparents did good, my parents did good, and I'll do even better.
I do think if you're not like aware of privilege, you should do this exercise, but it's more complicated.
So before we go any further, just take a moment, hand over the heart. Notice how you feel. Notice where that hit you, what stood out to you. Taking that moment to just pause and actually take it in with the heart and not just the mind. And then type in the chat box any reflections or any emotions or anything that you feel called to share of what came up for you. Emotional, Miss Brittany. Sad, Wendy. I think the part of that gets me often, and I don't know if you catch it, I've watched it so many times now that I catch all these little nuances, was the part where they're holding hands and the first time they have to let go, where they like can't hold hands anymore. It's like major for me. Yes, Lisa, you named it right at the same time. So beautiful. We're right in tandem with each other. Vulnerable, sad, frustrated, upset, but I've seen this before. Emotional, hard to name the emotion. Sad. It's about damn time this conversation is finally expanding. I grew up in a family that taught me to be aware and grateful for my privilege, but I never learned how to get past the guilt and shame for my good fortune. I got you, Carrie. Yes, yes, yes. Fiona, yes, everybody. Janet. I saw a much older version with high school kids in a field. Yeah, that's one of the most popular versions. So I see all of your comments coming in, and I want us to get into what's actually the most exciting piece of what we're going to do together today, which is we are going to take the privilege test virtually. So those of you who have my book know that there's a version of this in Stay Woke. This version that we're going to do today is a little bit different than that. And I've created a virtual version of the privilege test that we're going to be able to do together. And so here's how it's going to work. I'm going to say some phrases. If the phrase applies to you, you're going to take a +1 for a step forward. You'll take a -1 for a step back, and you'll put a 0 if you have no movement. Okay, so if it applies to you, you either go forward. If it doesn't apply, you go 0. And you'll see how this works. I'll go through the first 2 slowly, and then I'll go through the rest of them more quickly. There are 33 questions. That's my woo side. And we will get through them and see what happens at the end. So my recommendation is I would have a sheet or your computer and be putting like +1, -1, +1, 0, +1, 0. Make sure you include the zeros. And then what you'll do at the end is you'll add all of these up, and then you'll get your final score. And so you'll do +1, -1, which obviously cancels out, right? And my recommendation to you after doing this with thousands of people is do not try to do this directly in your calculator, because if you push one wrong button, you lost the whole thing, right? And you won't be able to go back. So I recommend actually writing it down or putting it somewhere, and then I'll give you a second to calculate at the end. All right. Any questions before we begin? No? All right. So I want you to, as we're going through this and I'm reading all the questions or the sentences, I want you to remember that as you're doing this, and maybe you're taking a step forward, there may be somebody in the group who's not moving, or as you're taking a step forward or standing still, there may be somebody who's taking a step back. And to feel how that dynamic is happening for each and every one of these groups, and really feel the resonance of each of the phrases. All right, I'll go through the first two slowly. Let's begin. If your parents or guardians work nights and weekends to support your household, take one step back. So if they did work nights and weekends, you would put a -1. If they did not work nights and weekends, you put a 0. So your options for this one are -1 and 0. Let's do the next one. If you can go shopping alone most of the time and be pretty well assured that you will not be followed or harassed, take one step forward. So your options for this one are +1 or 0. Y'all got it? And they'll kind of alternate like this. Here we go. If you are cisgender, meaning that your gender identity corresponds to your birth sex, take one step forward. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, take one step forward. If you have ever been diagnosed as having a physical or mental illness or disability, take one step back. If the primary language spoken in your household growing up was not English, take one step back. If you've ever tried to change your speech or mannerisms to gain credibility, take one step back. If you can go anywhere in the country and easily find the kinds of hair products you need and/or cosmetics that match your skin color, take one step forward. If you can pass as heterosexual, take one step forward. Even if you're not heterosexual, but you can walk into a room and people won't know. That's what this is asking. If you were embarrassed about your clothes or home while growing up, take one step back. If you are rarely asked to speak for all the people of your racial group, take one step forward. If you can legally marry the person you love, regardless of where you live, take one step forward. When asking to talk to the person in charge, if you're pretty certain you'll be facing a person of your race, take one step forward. If you or your parents have ever gone through a divorce, take one step back. If you can be late to a meeting without having lateness reflect on your race, take one step forward. If you're reasonably sure you would be hired for a job on the basis of your abilities and qualifications, take one step forward. If you would never think twice about calling the police when trouble occurs, take one step forward. If you can see a doctor whenever you feel the need, take one step forward. If you feel comfortable being emotionally expressive and open, take one step forward. If you have ever been the only person of your race, gender, socioeconomic status, or sexual orientation in a classroom or workplace setting, take one step back. If you took out loans for your education, take one step back. If you get time off for your religious holidays, take one step forward. If you need legal or medical help and you can be sure that your race will not work against you, take one step forward. If you have ever traveled outside of your home country, take one step forward. Remember these things, remembering the context of all the things, the privileges about what we haven't had to go through, and understanding on each one of these, there are people who have gone through them. Let's continue. If you feel confident that your parents would be able to financially help or support you if you were going through a serious monetary hardship, take one step forward. And if your parents are not alive, then you can just say your family here. If you feel confident that your family would be able to financially help or support you if you were going through a serious monetary hardship, take one step forward. If you have ever been bullied or made fun of because of something that you can't change, take one step back. If there were more than 50 books in your home growing up, take one step forward. If you studied the culture or the history of your ancestors in elementary school, take one step forward. If your parents or guardians attended college, take one step forward. If you ever went on a family vacation, take one step forward. If one of your parents or guardians was ever laid off or unemployed, not by choice, take one step back. Not by choice. They weren't choosing to be a stay-at-home anything. If you were ever uncomfortable about a joke or statement you overheard related to your race, ethnicity, gender, appearance, or sexual orientation, but felt unsafe to confront the situation, take one step back. And finally, if you have access to clean water, take one step forward. All right, before we do anything, you know the drill, hands over the heart, take a moment to pause. And just notice what you feel. Notice what's present for you, not demonizing any of it. Notice any resistance that comes up, any feelings that come up. Just welcome all of it forward. It's all there. Even the shadowy aspects that we sometimes are afraid to say or don't want to admit. Welcome them here in this brave space. I know you don't have safe spaces here. Brave space, courageous space. And then open your eyes and tally up your scores. Tally up your scores. And once you have tallied up your score, I would love to see your scores in the chat box. This is the best part. "17, Wendy. 10, Miss Brittany. 11, Holly. 4, Loke. 21, Megan. Carrie, 12. Clemmy, 8. 18. 14. 11. Keep them coming. 16, 10. 9, 17. So I'm putting the scale back up. And I'm curious, I'll try to make this a little bigger for you all real quick. So I'm curious Now, based on your score, the low end is -11, barely privileged is -5, privileged is 0, significantly privileged is 11, very privileged is 22. Are you landing anywhere different or about where you imagined you would land when we started, when I first showed this to you? I'd like to know in the chat box, are you where you imagined you'd be or somewhere a little bit different? Are there any surprises? Same, close to what you expected? Great. Beautiful, close, but a little different where you thought you would be, where you imagined you would be. So here's just a reference point. The lowest possible score was -11. The highest possible score is 22. My personal score is -4. And just notice where you are in comparison to your other family members here. And you can even scroll and look at people's scores and just feel the connection and compassion that here we are all here together. And given all these circumstances. Now, here is an important question, and I see you, Sharda. Here is an important question, and I want you all to be very, very honest with me, okay? Because this is about how we take this into our lives. How many of you felt an inkling, or maybe it was bigger than an inkling, of a wall come up that was like, how come he didn't ask about this? How come he didn't ask about, how come it didn't have this? How come the scale looks like that? How come there wasn't a question about sexual this or this thing or that thing? Did anybody feel that kind of come up of like, wait a second, how come this is not there? You can put some ones in the chat box if you had that come up for you. And the reason why this is important to name any resistance that comes up here, the shadow element, thank you, Deborah, for admitting it, of like, wait a second, how come that wasn't there? And how come these are all the questions? And if he asked different, maybe if he asked different questions, my score would be different, right? The reason why this is so important is if after an hour and some change of us talking about what is privilege and mindfully discussing and hearing the story and going in, if after an hour of us priming ourselves and you being in this group every week, if we still feel a little bit of come up when we talk about privilege, imagine how some of your friends and family members who've never done even a moment of inner work on themselves, who've never done any reading on this, feel when we point at them and say, you're privileged, you're racist. Imagine that level of resistance that comes up if we're even feeling it. Yeah, Holly, the questions that you were surprised not to hear mostly about abuse, that's often something that comes up, right? It's like, wow, why is that not here? You know? And so as soon as we get into that frame, right, we're immediately, because we go that direction, is we're going into the oppression Olympics. We're going into, wait, but I went through this. Wait, but I went through this and it's not accounted for. Remember, first of all, this is an exercise. It's not like the greatest privilege test of all time. We would be doing it for hours. But also it's a metaphor to show what arises for us when we show up in this space, and also to give us plenty of compassion when we look at, for example, a woman who I worked with who lives in Kansas, in a boarded up town that used to have auto factories that are now gone. And she has a shotgun next to her bed inside of her trailer park. And people are telling her, you're white, so you're privileged and you're racist and you should be doing stuff. And she's like, we don't even have cops here. I have a shotgun next to my bed. Don't tell me about fucking privilege. We can understand, right? We can have, and when we have friends and family members who get their wall totally goes up when we try to talk about any of this work, or our own walls go up when we talk about any of this kind of work, we can understand why, because this is a lot to come up to the surface, especially if we're even feeling things right now. And so this is a really important thing to name before I even start digging into how we take this forward. And in the beginning, I talked about this quote, which is kind of an ethos that I live by in all my speaking and teaching, is there are a lot of conversations about change, but few conversations that actually change something. And so I want to talk about taking this into our lives. So one of the things that's really important here, and somebody asked this earlier, which I can't remember who it was, but they said, like, I've learned to feel like guilt and shame for how privileged I actually am. I don't remember who that was. Holly, maybe, I don't remember, but Megan, oh, it was Carrie. Great. You know, how privileged I actually am. And a lot of people feel that way, right? Like I, at this point in my life, like given a lot of the questions about childhood, even though my score is a -4, if like with what I have now, I would have a very, 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 very different score, right? And so this changes depending on the questions, depending on the context, depending on what we're talking about. But the important thing is this. How many of you, I'm gonna ask a question. How many of you here, and you could just even like raise your hand in your screen, because I'm looking at you on gallery view now. How many of you have done any amount, and you don't have to be ashamed, any amount of anti-racism work over the last 1.5 years? Can you raise your hand? Cool, great, amazing, great. And not great meaning you're better or you're worse if you have or you haven't. It's because I'm gonna give you a context that I think is really important. There are shadow elements of unprocessed anger and rage inside of and underneath and in the soil of much of the anti-racism education that's happening right now. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I'm not saying that there is not incredible work to do, but there is a lot of shadow in there. And this is why transformational work is so important, and transformational leaders have to get into the space, because there's a lot of unprocessed anger and rage, rightful anger and rage, but that is informing itself in the wrong, and sometimes I think the wrong direction. And one of those directions is this, which Carrie, this might be where you got it, and many people have heard. It's this thing of, white people, you are so privileged, shut up, don't speak, pass the mic to Black people, don't say anything, don't talk about what you've gone through. We don't want to hear your guilt. We don't want to hear your tears. We don't want to hear anything that is happening. We don't want to hear you virtue signaling. If you're doing the work, don't talk about the fact that you're doing the work. Just sit back and do the work and pass the mic. I think that is terrible and stupid and wrong. Personally, I can only speak for myself and the work that I've done, okay? And the reason why I say that is because, check this out, in any other context, right? I'll say this, while I think, I want to be very specific, that element of what's happening inside many anti-racist spaces is the part that I think is wrong. Much of the other work that's happening inside the space I think is very right. So I just want to be very clear about what I'm disagreeing with here. But this part is really sneaky because it disempowers us in a really dramatic way. And it makes us feel guilt and shame. And what did we already uncover through decades of neuroscience? If you feel guilt and shame, you can't learn. If you feel guilt and shame, you can't move forward. If you feel guilt and shame, your creative centers of your brain literally are offline. This is evolutionarily biological. I don't care how much you chant and meditate, they're offline, right? It's smarter than our like kind of conscious mind system. And so how can we learn and change and move forward and create creative ideas if we're in a state of guilt and shame? And so what I'm going to invite you to do is, if we drop the guilt and drop the shame, just know that that is the guilt and the shame really is just making it more about you. That's really all it is making it more about yourself. And again, then we can feel guilty about the fact that we had guilt and shame, right? Which then is more guilt. It's like a cycle. So what I just say is just go, okay, there it is. There it is. That's the shadow. That's the inner critic coming in. That's actually what it is fear of me stepping in. It's actually fear coming in disguised, masquerading as guilt and shame. So then what I'm actually spending all my time working on is guilt and shame instead of the thing, instead of the actual thing that I should be doing, right? Because I'm processing my guilt and I'm talking about my white guilt and I'm going to therapy about my guilt, and then I'm having the shame. And then meanwhile, nothing's happened with mass incarceration because I've just been working on my shame. You know what I mean? And so that's like what ends up happening. And so the invitation that I'll invite you in, and this is where the finding your authentic voice comes, is check this out. Let's say you had, and somebody here did, a 21 out of 22 on this scale. You're one of the most privileged people based on this scale. But you had one thing that you went through. And let's say that one thing was you went through a massive divorce. Your parents went through a massive divorce when you were a child that ripped you up and really affected you in your life. But if you don't want to mention it, you don't want to talk about it, I don't want to talk about it because I'm so privileged, I shouldn't say it, you're missing your most authentic entry point. Because who better to help youth who are in broken homes than someone who went through a broken home? Your most authentic entry point are the places in your life where you've had to go through something that other people haven't. And if you have a 21 and you have all these other privileges, right? The way that I look at it is Shelley, who I teach the liberation experience, which is one of my programs specifically about racism and ending racism. I'll tell you about that later. She gives this example of like, if you have the privilege of getting out of a fire and there's people left in the fire, your job is to grab a hose and a bucket of water and pour water on that fire, not just run away. And bye, Holly. And with privilege, the more privileges you have, the more buckets you can carry. The more hoses you can grab and buy. And so it's not to have this shame and guilt of all the privilege that I've had. It's to say, wow, I can get so many buckets. And the place that I can lean in and help is a place where I too have been through something that can connect in with the heart of someone else. Shelley Tegelski, who again is my co-leader in the Liberation Experience, it's an 8-week program that I do on ending racism through mindfulness and compassion and emotional awareness and all these kind of things. One of her main things is she runs an organization for the last 7 years that is for survivors of mass shootings. So it's the families, and it started because she was in the community where the Parkland shooting happened at the school. It was so terrible, the little kids. And it was, and I'm sorry if this is triggering for anybody, but it's actually really inspiring what I'm going to share. So what she started was an organization where they certify in MBSR, which is mindfulness-based stress reduction through Jon Kabat-Zinn. They train people who have survived the gun violence. So the families, even if they lost a child, the families, the parents, people who were actually there on the scene, to train them, because when there's another mass shooting, they fly the survivors to the scene and they're the first people there meeting with the other survivors, because there's no one else who understands the language of what it's like to go through a mass shooting than someone who's been through it. Or no one understands the language of losing a child in their school than a mother who's lost her. No one else gets it. And so this is their way into help. Now, if we were, it seems like very common sense here, right? But if we put some of the social justice or anti-racism training on it, we would say, well, you know, I shouldn't go because I'm so privileged that I shouldn't talk about the fact that I went through a shooting because I didn't die and they lost their, this is kind of what we're doing in anti-racism work. You see how it doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't follow any of the research or any of what we know works. And there's another amazing study at the University of Miami, I think it's Miami or Florida, anyway, where I think I maybe mentioned this to you briefly last time, where they were doing a massive study on incorporating mindfulness into all the branches of the military, which it is now incorporated in. Did I mention this to you guys last time? Yeah. And so the other piece of that, other than finding the 12 minutes, was they found in their research over the multiple trials that they did that the teaching was more effective when it was a military officer teaching the practice, not a trained mindfulness person. So when they trained a military leader to lead the leaders in mindfulness, It was more effective than if it was somebody from the outside who was a mindfulness expert coming in to teach. And so this shows us, and they've studied this in many domains, that when you have the experience, that's your authentic way. So that's the secret sauce, is whatever you've been through. And you could go back through the privilege test, which is, you can either watch this recording or it's inside of my book, Stay Woke. I think many of you have my book. And you can go through and even look at what are some of the things that I've gone through that have impacted my life. And let me not spill it out and make it all about me. You guys know not to do that. You all know not to do that. But to use it as a point of connection and an entry point of where I can help. And so if you're looking specifically, like, you can be this tactical, and this is what I do. If you're looking specifically at, okay, maybe one of the things you went through was a massive divorce. I'll just use that same example. When you were a kid, your parents went through divorce. So, and maybe you're like, how do I help specifically in the Black Lives Matter movement? Okay, let me go find an organization that serves Black youth who are in broken homes or who've lost something because of the separation of their parents. There are hundreds of them. I know of several of them already off the top of my head. That's you're in, because you've been through it. And yeah, you may feel a little uncomfortable at first because, oh my God, I'm a white person here. That's all your ego, right? People are there, and this is what it takes for us to show up and help. So hopefully that helps Carrie and everyone else in terms of how we show up with our privilege. We grab more buckets. We use that to grab more buckets. And then I want to talk about, before I close, I want to talk about this, calling out versus calling forward, and calling forward really versus calling out. And this is one of the things that I talk about in depth, and we really lead to and teach in the liberation experience. But I want to give you some of the kind of tenets of it right now. So for those of you who need the language, what's kind of popular right now in call out culture or naming is calling out means you name something somebody did in public, you name it publicly. Calling in, which is kind of like the trend right now, is when you say it privately, you pull them aside and say it privately. I think both of those things are completely flawed and don't work if you're not calling them forward. What are we calling them forward into? And again, calling forward doesn't mean we absolve people of accountability. It doesn't mean all these stories that we attach to them. It just means this. What is the vision that we're inviting people into? This is a big piece of what's missing when we say what we're anti. Because being against something doesn't automatically say what we're for, but being for something does automatically say what we're against. I want to say that again. Being against something doesn't automatically say what we're for, but being for something does automatically say what we're against. It moves us in a direction. And I think this is a big piece of what's missing, and a big piece of what I'm inserting. I guess trying to is not even a good word. What I am inserting into the zeitgeist right now a bit is, what are we moving toward? And so if you don't have what we're moving toward, then we have no option but to just talk about what people are doing wrong. We have no option because we don't have anything that we're thinking of what we're moving toward specifically. We have this idea of what, quote unquote, justice. What does that fucking mean? You know what I mean? Like, really, what does that mean? And then we have something and we think it's justice, and then people online is like, this is not justice, you know? And you're like, okay, that's not justice. Okay, I thought we were moving towards that. So now what are we doing, you know? So what are we moving toward? And when you have something that you're moving toward, you have something, this is a piece of calling forward. Calling forward is an invitation to be something greater. Is an invitation to be something greater. And if we don't have that something greater that we're leaning into, then all we can say is, here's what you did wrong, here's what you did wrong, now go figure it out. You're racist. But notice, isn't it fascinating that we don't have a term for whatever this other thing is that we're moving towards? It's really interesting because, like, right, feminist or feminism is a moving towards something, right? We're like racism, and racism it is still moving towards something, I guess, but it's moving towards a bad thing. We're like feminist is more, I guess it depends on what fucking side you're on, whether it's bad or good, right? But it's just interesting the way that all plays out. But there's no word really yet for, like, okay, if I'm not racist, I am what? anti-racist? I don't know. That doesn't seem like the answer to me. Do you know what I mean? Like, I want to become something greater, not just like an effect of something that I'm against. And so I don't know, maybe some of you have ideas. What is the word? What is this? What is the thing that we are becoming? What is the dream that we're stepping into? And this is what we have. This is what our generation in this cycle of infinity, this is what we have the opportunity to figure out and do. We're in kind of the infancy of this work. And so the tenets, I'll be very quick, very clear about them, of calling forward versus calling in or out, is, and you could call someone out or in and do it forward, and then it's still fine. So number one is no shame, no blame. No shame, no blame, ever. I don't care how bad it is. No shame, no blame, right? Number two is, calling forward doesn't mean that you don't hold them accountable. So it's not just like, well, it's okay that you just burned a swastika on my lawn. Do you know, like, that's not what I'm talking about. That's not it, you know, that it's okay. You know, I'm holding with love and compassion. I'm not mean that it needs to be timid and mild, you know? And number three is, what are we inviting people into? It's an invitation to be something greater. Yeah, Fiona, I hear you. And so this is the power of what we have the opportunity to do now as a collective. And so I'm going to invite you all into just a short inquiry, just to put your hands over your heart. Close your eyes. And just ask yourself, and just trust what comes up as you drop into your energetic space fully. What is something that I've been through that has deeply impacted me in my life? And don't let your mind go into, well, that's not big enough. That's not, what's too small. None of that. Just anything. And then ask yourself, what is a practical step that I can take to help others who are in this position now? So you might pick something that you've been through, that you've moved beyond, that you've gone to a different level with now at this point in your life. And then you can ask, what is a practical step that I can take to help others who are going through this now? And maybe the practical step is, gosh, I don't know. So maybe my first practical step is, I'm going to just research. Are there people going through this? Where are they? Who are they? I'm just going to do 15 minutes on Google. Maybe that's your first step. Maybe the step is donating to a cause. If you have a lot of privilege, maybe it's donating a lot. Maybe it's providing a scholarship. Maybe it's showing up to a protest or a march. Maybe it's showing up to a meeting or an event. Maybe it's dedicating some of your time or resources or abilities and skills and knowledge to a board of directors or a community, volunteering your services of your company. So when we say, I don't know what to do, we just have to ask the right way. And so much can unfold. And if each of us step in a way that is authentic to us, then, as my sister and colleague Shelley Tagelski always says, with enough pebbles thrown into the pond, a ripple becomes a wave. And may we each be the waves of change that we seek. So take a breath in and out, and then maybe you type your ideas into the chat box of what a practical step might be for you. And I think this will be really valuable for us to explore. Let's see, I'm waiting for your chat responses. In the meantime, I'm pulling up a link to something for you all as well. Take your time, but don't take too long. I'm teasing. Okay. There we go. That's what I was looking for. So I realize I'm doing something already and I did not know. Share my stories about adoption with others. Massive. Using my appreciation experience of trauma to teach frontline staff and mental health professionals. Beautiful. Posting more around the gender inequality and how it impacts our lives in subtle ways. I love your analogy of step. Yes, thank you. My step is to run a group based on the book, How to Think If You Want to Change the World. How I bridge the gap of understanding between the sustenance way of life in the Hawaiian people as compared to consumerism and dominant culture. Beautiful, Loke. Mentoring kids who are underprivileged, finding support groups for people who've lost someone too soon, reaching out to others going through severe injuries in their families, working with women, answering the question, still not out of the hole. Yep, it's good. Empowering others, you got it. And so I wanna give you all a few resources here that will help you as you move forward. And again, if there's a specific community that you feel called to work in, right? Black Lives Matter, Asian organization, whatever it is, you can use these same skills, right? You can say, okay, mentoring underprivileged youth about adoption. You can go to an agency and offer some of your skills to an agency that is of Black children or Asian children. You can go and talk about gender inequality in any of these contexts, right? In queer communities, in Black communities, in this, there's so many organizations and places that you can step into. Mental health professionals, there's entire organizations of mental health professionals that are of certain types of classifications of people rather. And so this is ways that you can actively step in now, not later when you learn enough, when you do enough, when something, ends up finally happening. And so I want to give you a couple quick resources. And I know we're close on time, but I ran a little over because we had our tech snafu, so I apologize. Is right here. So the first thing is, I'm typing it in. So there's a link right there. It's a list of resources that I created called Conscious Resources to End Racism. And I want you to all go to that link and put in your name and email. It's totally free. It has a version of this talk, slightly different, but that you can share with others. It has my top 5 favorite books to read on these topics. I know we all learn in different ways. It has my favorite podcasts on this topic. It has my favorite audiobooks on the topic. It has my favorite videos on the topics. And it's a short list. I know there's these like ridiculously long lists and we look at them and we're like, I don't know where to start. This list is like, these are my ultimate essentials. And it also has the Ending Racism pledge, okay, there as well. So that's the link. It's justinmichaelwilliams.com/fightracism, all lowercase. And then secondly, I mentioned to you the liberation experience. So we're currently inside of a cohort right now. We're on week 6 of 8 with a group who's been inside of it. And it's one of my favorite programs to run. But I want to give you a special invitation here to get on the wait list for the next program that launches in the fall, or the opportunity to give scholarships. So many of you may not know, I have a 501c3 organization called the Dream Bigger Foundation, a nonprofit. And the Liberation Experience is run fully through the Dream Bigger Foundation. And so any scholarships that you give are fully tax deductible. 60% of our participants are on full scholarships. And we have about 300 people, it's like 290 something. And it's a program that, again, is not just talking about change, but helping us change something. So we actually bring people together across divides. We use this model that I created called the Infinity Model, and we group ourselves together in different groups, and then we actually come together to practice having the conversations. We have templates for conversation, how to call people forward, how to call them out, literal fill in the blanks. But then first, all the work that you have to do before that to be able to be a person that can hold the container. Because oftentimes when we're the ones having the conversation at that dinner table, No one else in your friend group or your family has done this work. So you have to hold the space for everybody, right? And so how do we become emotionally strong and resilient, learn how to communicate, learn how to have, so this is what the liberation experience is all about. It's really amazing. We break into small groups. There's people from all over the world, and you get to actually experience having it with people across divides, which is really fun. So the next program launches in October. You can get on the wait list at liberationx.org, or you can even go there now and give a tax-deductible scholarship for our next cohort. They're very, very appreciated. We have a trained trauma-informed therapist on every call to help people with stuff that comes up. And it's like really an amazing thing that has been put together that I'm so proud of. And I would be excited to have you all there. But even if not, there's the free resources there for you as well. So in closing, what I'll share is this. This is about the internal work that we all must do to make the external world show up differently. It can't just be, just like my last talk, this is the connection, this is the collective part of my last talk that I did with you all. It can't just be about the internal meditating and then no action, right? This is about the internal work so that we can show up and do the collective work and do what's in the highest good and make the right next move. And I think back, to my family. My gosh, I think back to my family and everything that they all had to go through. And again, could have never really fully imagined that this big trauma that my family went through could turn out like this and could put me in a position with the privilege to speak to you all in this way today, to help call each of us forward into a greater future and a greater world and reality that we all get to co-create together as we end racism in this lifetime. So thank you so much for having me. I know there's a little closing exercise you like to do, Leah, but I don't know if you have time for it, but I'm happy to stay. It's 2 a.m. here and I'm wide awake, which is great.
Justin, thank you. Thank you for taking one of the hardest, touchiest, complex topics of our time and speaking to the things that so many things aren't being talked about and providing so much access and so much love. I think one of my favorite moments was that moment where you really modeled, the moment where you caught yourself doing a lupe, and rather than doing the kind of self-slap flagellation that so many of us are taught, what it looks like to pause and how beneficial that is for everyone when you can meet yourself in that way. It was such a beautiful expression of the internal work to the external. And